"Tell your brother what you bought with his money," my mother said. The heavy oak dining table carried the sharp scent of lemon polish, and the grandfather clock in the corner ticked with a hollow, rhythmic thud. I pressed my fingertips against the edge of the wood, feeling the cold grain. The gold stripes on the sleeve of my service dress blues felt stiff against my wrist. I was 39 years old, a commander in the United States Navy managing logistics for thousands of sailors, and Gloria Mercer was still trying to send me to my room. "Bring the car papers," my father added. Thomas Mercer sat across from me, his weathered hands resting next to a thick stack of documents. Through the living room window, the morning sun reflected off the pristine hood of the $135,000 Porsche parked in their driveway. My mother leaned forward, her voice dropping to that hushed tone she used when she wanted witnesses. "We saw the photo on Instagram, Natalie. You owe this family an explanation." I did not defend myself. I just looked around the room, taking inventory the way I had been trained to do. My brother Caleb usually sat at the end of the table, but his chair was gone. Down the hallway, a small suitcase sat packed and waiting by the front door. Next to it, resting on the console table, lay a torn bank envelope. I filed those 3 details away, keeping my face completely neutral. My father pushed his stack of documents across the polished wood. The pages made a soft scraping sound. I reached into my bag, pulled out a separate file, and placed a single document face down between us. "Read yours first," I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Then read mine." He did not know it yet, but the paper I had just put on the table was a court order. That meeting happened at the very end of June. But the real break, the moment I finally stopped trying to save people who did not want to be saved, started exactly 3 weeks earlier. On the morning of June 7th, the day I got married, I woke up alone in a bridal suite at a small waterfront inn in Norfolk. The wind coming off the bay whipped the flag ropes against the metal poles outside my window, a sharp, clanging sound that cut through the quiet room. The air smelled of sea salt and strong black coffee from the lobby downstairs. I stood in front of the full-length mirror, letting the cold silk lining of my wedding dress settle against my skin. My phone sat on the vanity. The screen remained completely dark. No missed calls, no messages from my parents, asking if I needed help getting ready. Downstairs, on the lawn facing the water, the wedding coordinator had already set up the folding chairs for the ceremony. I had instructed her to reserve 3 specific seats in the front row, 2 for my parents and 1 for Caleb. I had spent the last 2 months arranging specialized transport for my brother, making sure the venue was accessible, and sending my mother the schedule 5 different times. At exactly 9 o'clock, the phone finally buzzed against the wooden table. It was a voicemail from my mother. I picked it up, hit play, and held the speaker close to my ear. "We won't celebrate a daughter who abandoned her family to play soldier." Gloria's voice filled the quiet room, tight and coated in that familiar, punishing disappointment. "Caleb is far too weak for a crowd today anyway. His condition flared up last night, and I won't leave him alone just so you can have your party. Do not call and upset him." I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence after the recording ended. The silk dress suddenly felt heavy. I did not call her back to argue, and I did not dial my father to ask him to intervene. Instead, my thumb hovered over the screen, and I moved the audio file into a locked folder on my phone. I walked out to the balcony, looking down at the white chairs arranged on the grass. I called the coordinator. I told her to leave the 3 reserved seats exactly where they were, right in the front row. Evan found me 20 minutes later in the empty hallway outside the main reception room. He stood quietly in his dark suit, watching me fix a stray pin in my hair. He did not tell me to forget about my family, and he did not offer empty platitudes about how it was their loss. He just watched my hands tremble slightly as I adjusted the veil. "Do you want to delay?" Evan asked gently, stepping closer but giving me space. "We can wait an hour. We can change the seating arrangement so you do not have to look at the empty chairs, or we can leave right now and just go get a drink. It is entirely up to you." I looked at the man I was about to marry, taking a slow, deep breath to steady my chest. "No," I said, letting my hands drop to my sides. "I spent my whole life waiting for them to decide I was worth showing up for. We are doing this right now." When the music started, I walked down the aisle. I kept my eyes on Evan, and I did not look back at the heavy wooden doors a second time. The ceremony went exactly as planned, and by the time the afternoon reception rolled around, the noise of the music and the clinking glasses almost drowned out the sting of the empty front row. I smiled for the cameras, cut the cake, and talked with Evan's family. Then, right as the caterers began clearing the dinner plates, a young receptionist from the front desk approached my table. She carried a plain white envelope, holding it out to me with a polite smile. "Someone dropped this off for you at the front desk," she said, before turning away to check on a vendor. I stepped away from the music, walking into the quiet corridor near the coat check, and broke the seal. Inside the envelope was an old birthday card. It was one of those cheap, generic ones from a pharmacy, slightly bent at the corners and smelling faintly of stale drawer liners. I turned it over. On the back, written in thick black marker, were the uneven, blocky letters I would recognize anywhere. It was Caleb's handwriting. My brother struggled with fine motor skills, and his letters always tilted heavily to the right. The message was only 5 words long. "Ask me directly, not Mom." My fingers traced the edge of the cardboard. There was no return address on the envelope, and no note explaining who had bypassed my mother to deliver it. Someone had driven to the venue, handed it to the desk, and left. I pulled out my phone and dialed the private number I had set up for Caleb 3 months ago. It rang 4 times, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. I expected my mother's voice to answer, ready to demand why I was disobeying her orders. Instead, a male voice whispered through the static, breathless and rushed. "Nat," Caleb said, his voice catching in his throat. "I didn't tell them about the bank letter." The line went dead. The sudden silence left a ringing pressure in my ear. A bank letter. My brother whispering about financial documents on my wedding day meant the wall I had spent the last 18 months building was finally cracking open on his end. To understand why a single bank letter terrified him, you have to understand how the money worked in our family. For years, I believed paying for things was how I protected him. Whenever my mother called, I opened my banking app. New wheelchair ramp. Physical therapy copays. Legal fees for his disability trust. I transferred the funds without asking questions, convinced my salary was the only thing keeping his life stable. That habit broke in January of the previous year. I was sitting at my desk at the naval base in Norfolk, reviewing a supply manifest for an upcoming deployment. The office was quiet, save for the low hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of boots on the hallway tile. My phone vibrated against the metal surface of my desk. The screen showed my mother's name. Gloria Mercer rarely called during my working hours unless something had broken, crashed, or required immediate funding. I answered, keeping my eyes on the manifest. "I have about 10 minutes before a briefing. Is everything okay?" "We need $6,000, my mother said, skipping any greeting. The background noise sounded like a daytime television show, a studio audience clapping, not a hospital waiting room or a doctor's office. "Did something happen?" I asked, setting my pen down. "Caleb had a setback with his motor functions. The specialist wants to start an intensive physical therapy block tomorrow, and the insurance is refusing to cover it." My mother paused. I knew what that silence meant. The woman was waiting for the familiar sound of my keyboard clicking as I logged into my banking portal. For years, that was my exact routine. I would feel a spike of adrenaline, imagine my brother hurting, and send the money before the call even ended. But $6,000 was an unusually large lump sum, even for specialized care. I kept my hands flat on my desk. "Send me the clinic's name and the invoice," I told her. "I will call my bank and wire it directly to their billing department. It is faster than sending it to your checking account and waiting for it to clear. The television volume in the background suddenly muted. The silence stretched across the line, heavy and thick. "I just gave you the name," my mother snapped, her pitch rising. "Dr. Eris, at the rehabilitation center. Why are you making this complicated when your brother is in pain?" "I am not making it complicated. I just need the paperwork for the wire transfer." "Family should not need proof to help each other," she said, and the call disconnected. My jaw ached. I had been grinding my teeth without realizing it. Something cold and heavy settled behind my ribs. I opened a blank spreadsheet on my computer and typed 2 words at the top: Caleb Care. For the next 3 hours, I did not authorize any transfers. I pulled 5 years of my own bank statements, sorting them by date and destination account. Line by line, a pattern emerged, stark and undeniable. The requests always spiked in the middle of the month, usually right after my military pay period. The funds always went into my parents' joint checking account. None of the money had ever gone directly to a medical provider. I set up columns: date, provider, purpose, confirmation. I categorized the transfers, my logistics training taking over when the personal betrayal started to cloud my focus. I was a naval officer. I tracked millions of dollars in equipment and supplies every month. I knew how to follow a paper trail, but I had never thought to audit my own mother. 2 days later, my phone chimed. My mother had texted a scanned image of a clinic invoice. There was no accompanying message, just the attachment. I opened the file on my monitor. The document looked wrong immediately. The logo at the top was pixelated, bleeding at the edges like a bad photocopy that had been scanned and reprinted multiple times. The date format used European styling, which did not match any standard American billing software. I pulled up my Caleb Care spreadsheet and checked the service code listed under the description. It was identical to a receipt she had sent me 6 months earlier for a completely different neurological evaluation. I dialed the phone number printed at the bottom of the page. It did not ring to a switchboard or a receptionist. A generic automated voice simply asked me to leave a message. I hung up. I opened a public directory and searched the actual name of the physical therapy center. The official phone number was entirely different. I dialed it, and a billing clerk answered on the second ring, her voice bright and professional over the low hum of a busy medical office. "I am calling to verify an invoice number," I said, reading the string of digits from my mother's scan. "I know you cannot provide patient records, and I am not asking for any medical information protected by privacy laws. I just need to know if this is a valid billing code in your current system." Keyboard keys clacked over the phone. The clerk paused, and the typing stopped. "That invoice number does not exist," the woman told me. "Are you sure?" "Positive. Our invoice sequence changed late last year. We no longer use that prefix, so that format is obsolete." I kept my voice perfectly steady, though my fingers gripped the edge of my desk tight enough to turn my knuckles white. "Could you send me a brief email confirming that this specific invoice number was not issued by your office today?" The clerk agreed, sensing the tension in my voice but keeping her questions to herself. I hung up the phone and stared at the blurred scan on my monitor. Gloria Mercer had not just exaggerated a cost. She had manufactured a document. I picked up my phone and called my parents' house. My mother answered quickly, her tone entirely shifted from 2 days ago. She sounded exhausted, fragile, playing the role of the devoted caregiver pushed to the brink of collapse. "I spoke with the clinic," I said. "They have no record of that bill." A sharp intake of breath came through the receiver. Then the crying started. My mother wept, loud and ragged, accusing me of trying to catch her in a lie when she was only trying to keep her son alive. She claimed the billing department made a mistake, that the administrative staff always messed up Caleb's files because they did not care about disabled patients. "Your father had to dip into the mortgage fund to cover the first session," my mother sobbed, her words tumbling over each other. We are going to lose the house because you want to play detective. You are sitting in your office, passing judgment on the people actually doing the hard work." The line fumbled, the sound of the receiver brushing against fabric, and my father's voice replaced hers. Thomas Mercer always spoke in a low, measured rumble. The sound of a reasonable man just trying to keep the peace, the reluctant mediator in a house of high emotion. "Natalie," my father said, "your mother knows what he needs. She is under a lot of stress with his treatments, and the insurance companies are constantly fighting her. Stop interrogating her, and just help your family." For years, that tone would have shamed me into compliance. My father rarely asked for anything, so when he did, it felt like an absolute command. He positioned himself as the neutral party, the tired husband just trying to hold his family together. He made you feel like questioning Gloria was an attack on him, but the obsolete invoice number was still glowing on my computer screen. "I will send $200 for Caleb's groceries this week," I told him. "I am not sending $6,000 for a bill that does not exist." I ended the call. My hands shook slightly as I logged into my bank, authorized the $200, and closed the window. I had not cut them off completely, but I had stopped the bleed. It was a terrifying boundary to set, knowing Caleb was caught on the other side of it. That night, my townhouse in Virginia Beach was quiet. The only light in the living room came from my laptop screen. I sat on the sofa, cross-referencing the fake invoice against every older receipt my mother had ever emailed me over the past 5 years. I started noticing the same misaligned margins, the identical service descriptions, the same suspicious mid-month timing perfectly aligned with my pay schedule. Footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor behind me. Evan walked into the room, holding 2 mugs of tea. We were only engaged at the time, but he already knew the rhythm of my family's crises. He set a mug on the coaster next to my laptop and looked at the complex spreadsheet filling my screen, ready to work. "Do you want me to help you sort those?" Evan asked, his voice calm. He did not ask what they had done this time. He just looked at the problem in front of me. "I cannot prove anything major yet," I said, keeping my eyes on the glowing rows of data. A fake invoice could just mean she panicked about a different bill and tried to cover it up so I would not ask questions. It is not enough to accuse anyone of theft. "Then why are you building a timeline at 2 in the morning? I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the warm ceramic mug. "Because I need to make sure I do not forget this happened. If I do not write it down, she will eventually convince me I remembered it wrong." Evan nodded. He pulled up a chair next to mine, opened his own laptop, and started helping me digitize the paper records I had kept in a shoebox under my desk. We worked in silence for another hour. I created a secure cloud folder, backed it up to an external drive, and locked it in my safe. I was not building a legal case yet. I was just building a wall around my own sanity. For the next 1.5 years, the pattern held. Every time my mother demanded a large sum, I offered to pay the vendor directly. Every time, she found a reason why that was impossible, followed by a week of guilt trips and silence. I kept sending small amounts for food and basic supplies, ensuring Caleb had essentials, but the massive cash transfers stopped. My parents treated me like a traitor, but they never brought up the clinic again. They thought I had let it go. They thought the conflict was over. They were wrong. Just before midnight, my email application chimed softly. It was the message from the clinic's billing department. I clicked the subject line and read the brief text on the screen. The clerk had verified the fake invoice number, just as promised. But they had added one more sentence at the bottom, a piece of information I had not even thought to ask for. The words were typed in plain, black text. "We have not treated Caleb Mercer since April 2 years ago." I stared at the screen. My mother had sent me 8 separate invoices bearing that clinic's name during those 2 years. 8 emergencies, 8 urgent transfers to save my brother from pain. The money I thought was love had never reached him at all. 8 fake invoices. That revelation fundamentally changed the architecture of my family. I had stopped the massive cash transfers, but the silence from my parents over the next year carried a weight of its own. They were waiting for me to break. Instead, I focused on severing our financial ties completely, securing my own future before they could drain it entirely. In the spring of 2025, I stood in the empty living room of my Virginia Beach townhouse. The air smelled of fresh paint and commercial carpet cleaner. I rested my hand against the cool drywall, feeling the solid structure under my palm. I had purchased this property years ago, long before meeting Evan, paying the mortgage down through consecutive naval deployments. Every coat of paint, every repaired floorboard, every appliance came from my own salary and the rental income I managed while overseas. None of the equity belonged to my parents. The closing attorney, a man with tired eyes and a neat stack of folders, slid the final settlement statement across the kitchen island. The proceeds from the sale were substantial. He explained, the wire transfer would hit my personal account by the end of the business day. I folded the heavy paper carefully and placed it into my leather briefcase. That specific document would eventually become the ultimate shield against my family, though its true value would not surface until the family meeting a few weeks later. I locked the front door for the last time, keeping the spare key in my pocket as a physical reminder of what I had built on my own. That evening, Evan and I sat at the dining table in our new shared home. A glossy brochure for a local luxury car dealership lay open on the wood surface. I had delayed buying the Porsche for years. Every time my savings account reached a certain threshold, my mother would call with a fabricated medical crisis, and the car fund would vanish into her joint checking account. Evan watched me trace the edge of the heavy paper. He asked if I was absolutely sure about the purchase. He was not questioning my finances, but he knew how deeply my guilt ran whenever Caleb was involved. My chest tightened slightly at the mention of my brother. I took a slow breath, letting the tension release from my shoulders. I told Evan I had already established a separate, protected legal fund for Caleb. Buying a car with my own hard-earned equity was not stealing from my brother. Allowing my mother to dictate my joy was no longer an option. I logged into the dealership portal and deposited the earnest money. There were no social media posts, no bragging phone calls to relatives. It was a quiet transaction, meant only for me. My wedding was scheduled for the first week of June. A month before the ceremony, the fragile piece finally snapped. I contacted the vocational center where Caleb attended therapy sessions, wanting to arrange accessible, supported transport so he could attend the wedding safely. Gloria found out within 48 hours. My phone rang, and her voice came through the speaker, sharp and absolute. She claimed Caleb could not handle crowds. She insisted the sensory overload would trigger a medical episode and that keeping him home was a clinical necessity. I gripped the edge of my desk, keeping my tone measured. I offered to set up a video call. I simply wanted to ask my brother directly if he felt up to attending a small waterfront ceremony. My mother refused instantly. She called my request a gross violation of her authority as his primary caregiver. The real reason for her refusal arrived 3 days later. Gloria called back, skipping any pleasantries. The background on her end was dead quiet, meaning my father was likely sitting right next to her, listening in complete silence. She laid out her terms with chilling precision. First, I needed to resume the monthly cash transfers to her account. Second, I had to stop attempting private contact with Caleb. Finally, she demanded, I dedicate a portion of my wedding reception speech to publicly thank my parents for their endless sacrifices. If those conditions were not met, neither of them would attend the ceremony. The silence on the line stretched out, heavy and expectant. She waited for me to apologize, to offer a compromise, to beg for my parents to be present on my wedding day. My jaw ached. I looked out the window at the gray sky, feeling a strange sense of absolute clarity wash over me. The invitation stays, I told her. The conditions do not. I did not raise my voice, and I did not wait for her to argue. I let her end the call. The line went dead, leaving a hollow dial tone echoing in the quiet room. Less than an hour later, my phone buzzed against the table. A text message appeared on the screen, sent from Caleb's designated number. The message read, "I do not want to see you get married." I stared at the illuminated screen, reading the sentence a second time. The syntax was flawless. Proper capitalization, correct punctuation, 0 typos. Caleb never texted like that. His fine motor skill challenges made his text messages brief, fragmented, and messy. The cadence of those words belonged entirely to Gloria. She was using his device to manufacture a rejection, forcing his digital voice to match her narrative. I did not respond with anger, and I did not call back to accuse her of impersonating him. I simply typed a single reply. "I will ask you directly, when it is safe." A week before the wedding, an unrecognized number flashed on my caller ID. I answered cautiously. It was Mara Ellis, the vocational rehabilitation specialist at Caleb's center. She spoke carefully, weighing every word against strict privacy regulations. Mara stated that Caleb had recently asked her a specific question during a counseling session. He wanted to know if he had the legal right to keep his personal mail private from his guardians. Due to federal guidelines, Mara could not share any further details without Caleb's explicit consent. But the implication hung clearly in the air. Someone at the center was listening to my brother. Someone was helping him understand his fundamental rights as an adult. My pulse quickened, but I thanked her, keeping my questions restrained so I would not jeopardize her professional standing or alert my parents to our communication. Just before hanging up, Mara paused. The background noise of the vocational center faded slightly, as if she had stepped into a quiet hallway. She said she was handing the receiver to Caleb for exactly 1 minute. The line fumbled with the sound of shuffling plastic. Then, my brother's voice came through, slow and breathless. "They open everything," he whispered, "even the letters with my name." In the background, a door hinge creaked open, followed immediately by Gloria's sharp voice demanding to know who was on the phone. The call terminated instantly. The disconnected call left a heavy silence in my office. Knowing my mother was actively monitoring Caleb's conversations meant waiting was no longer a viable strategy. 2 days after that interrupted phone call, I submitted a request for personal leave at the naval base, traded my uniform for civilian clothes, and drove straight to the Vocational Rehabilitation Center in Chesapeake. Mara Ellis met me in the lobby. The specialist offered a brief, professional nod before guiding me down a quiet hallway toward a private conference room. She opened the door and stepped aside. Caleb sat at a round laminate table. My brother wore a faded blue sweater, his hands resting flat against the faux wood grain. He looked up when I entered, and the tension around his eyes eased just a fraction. Mara took a seat near the door, clearly establishing her role as an observer rather than an active participant, and left the floor to us. I pulled out a chair opposite him, keeping my voice steady and low. I asked him to tell me what was happening at home. Caleb processed the question for a moment, his gaze fixed on the table before he slowly met my eyes. "I do not get to keep my debit card," he explained, his words deliberate and measured. "Mom says the bank makes mistakes. She says, if I try to live on my own, I will die in a week." My chest tightened instantly. The protective instinct, honed over decades of watching him struggle to navigate a world that moved too fast for him, surged forward. I leaned across the table, desperate to fix the immediate threat. "You do not have to stay in that house," I told him. "You can come live with me and Evan in Virginia Beach. We have the guest room ready. I will handle the paperwork and take care of everything." Caleb stiffened. His shoulders pulled upward toward his ears, a physical manifestation of a defensive wall slamming shut. He looked away, staring hard at the blank whiteboard on the far wall. "That is you deciding," my brother whispered. The words felt like a physical strike. I froze, the breath catching in my throat. I had spent the entire drive convinced I was orchestrating a rescue mission, yet in less than 5 minutes I had made the exact same mistake our parents made every single day. I was erasing his agency under the guise of keeping him safe. I forced myself to sit back, unclenched my jaw, and folded my hands in my lap. "You are right," I said quietly, making sure he heard the genuine regret in my tone. "I am sorry. This is your life. What do you want to happen?" The tension slowly drained from his shoulders. Caleb did not need a savior to dictate his future. He simply needed a microphone. He laid out his goals with absolute clarity. He wanted to hold his own mobile phone without someone reading his messages. He wanted to keep a portion of his paycheck from his part-time sorting job. He wanted to choose his own apartment, and he needed someone to explain complex rental contracts to him without simply ordering him to sign the bottom line. Most importantly, he explicitly stated he did not want me to become his new guardian. He wanted an independent advocate, someone who did not answer to our parents and did not answer to his older sister. 30 minutes later, Avery Sloan walked into the conference room. The disability rights attorney carried a plain leather briefcase and possessed an unhurried, methodical presence. She sat down, introduced herself, and immediately turned her attention entirely to Caleb. Avery completely ignored my presence in the room until my brother gave her verbal authorization to include me in the conversation. Once Caleb nodded his approval, the attorney laid out the legal reality. She explained the situation involved two completely separate tracks. The first was personal rights, addressing who made medical and living decisions. The second was the financial conservatorship, controlling his assets. "You can provide your records," Avery told me, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "Your transaction history and those mismatched invoices are valuable evidence. But you cannot direct the testimony, and you cannot speak for him in court. Caleb is the client." I nodded, accepting the boundary without hesitation. I watched my brother carefully read through a limited authorization form, Avery pausing to explain a specific legal term whenever he tapped his finger against the paper. When he finally signed his name, the uneven letters leaning heavily to the right, a profound sense of relief washed over me. We spent the next hour building a secure communication line. Caleb received a prepaid mobile phone, registered under a separate account, which he would keep hidden in his locker at the vocational center. Mara confirmed that, according to the facility's strict privacy policies, he could use the center as a safe mailing address for any legal correspondence. Before we packed up to leave, I unzipped my bag and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a high-quality photocopy of the handwritten message he had managed to smuggle to me. I slid it across the table until it rested in front of him. "Ask me directly." I read the copied words aloud. "That is the rule from now on. I will never assume I know what is best for you again." Caleb touched the paper, a small, genuine smile appearing on his face. Our careful planning was almost shattered 10 minutes later. The meeting had run slightly longer than scheduled, and Gloria Mercer arrived early for her daily pickup routine. I was standing near the reception desk with my brother when the glass entry doors swung violently open. My mother marched into the lobby, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. Her gaze swept over the room, landing on me, and her expression hardened into absolute fury. She closed the distance between us, completely ignoring the other patients and staff members in the waiting area. "What are you doing here?" Gloria demanded, her voice loud enough to turn several heads. "You have no business interfering with his medical schedule. You are just confusing him." I kept my hands relaxed at my sides, refusing to engage in a public screaming match. Before I could formulate a neutral response, Caleb took a deliberate step forward, placing himself between me and our mother. "I asked her to come," he stated, his voice carrying surprising volume. Gloria dismissed him with a rapid wave of her hand, not even looking at his face. She turned her attention to Mara, who had just walked out of the administrative office. My son does not understand what he is asking for, the older woman declared, adopting her familiar tone of exhausted martyrdom. His cognitive deficits make him highly susceptible to suggestion. Natalie is manipulating him because she is angry about a disagreement we had. Mara did not argue. The specialist simply gave a polite, non-committal nod, pulled a pen from her pocket, and wrote the exact exchange down in her clinical notepad. Every dismissal, every attempt to speak over him, was quietly documented with a time and date stamp. I left the center through the side exit, getting into my car while Gloria ushered Caleb toward the parking lot. The confrontation in the lobby had been ugly, but it served a vital purpose. My parents now knew I was circling, but they severely underestimated the trap closing around them. They still believed I was acting alone. That evening, the first real piece of actionable financial evidence arrived. My secure phone chimed with an incoming message from Caleb's new prepaid number. I opened the text, and the image loaded slowly on the screen. It was a photograph taken in the dim light of his bedroom. The picture showed a bank envelope bearing his name, the top edge violently ripped open by someone else's hands. Beside the torn paper lay a formal withdrawal notice from the financial institution holding his primary care funds. The printed text detailed a massive outgoing transfer request. My parents had initiated the movement of a massive sum of money, and the destination account belonged entirely to Thomas Mercer. I stared at the glowing numbers, the reality of their panic setting in. They knew Caleb had spoken to someone at the center, and they were trying to drain the accounts before morning. I forwarded the image to Avery Sloan and waited for the legal machinery to finally activate. The heavy manila folder hit the mahogany conference table with a dull, heavy slap. Avery Sloan opened the cover, her dark eyes scanning the spreadsheet I had printed the night before. The disability rights attorney sat in silence, turning the pages of my Caleb care file. The air in the narrow room smelled of dry printer paper and bitter espresso. I sat across from her, my hands folded tightly in my lap. I brought only the documents I had received legally, the mismatched therapy receipts my mother had emailed me over the years, the confirmation message from the actual clinic denying the validity of those bills, the detailed ledger of every transfer I had executed from my personal accounts spanning half a decade. Avery separated the papers into 3 neat stacks. She labeled them verbally, pointing to each pile. Facts, assumptions, missing records. "We cannot operate on assumptions," the attorney explained, tapping a manicured finger against the middle pile. "We must stick strictly to the documented reality. You cannot call any more medical providers asking questions about Caleb. You cannot log into any accounts that do not legally bear your name. If we are going to build a protective barrier around your brother, your hands must remain completely clean." I nodded, accepting the boundary. The instinct to act, to tear the front door down and drag Caleb out of that house, burned hot in my chest. A rushed rescue mission would only validate my mother's narrative that I was an unstable sibling trying to kidnap a vulnerable adult. I had to let the lawyer do her job. Avery reached into her own leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of stapled documents. She slid them across the polished wood. "These are public conservatorship accounting reports," Avery said. "Your father is legally required to file them with the circuit court every 12 months. They outline exactly how the assets are managed." I pulled the stack closer. The pages felt coarse against my fingertips. I traced the columns of numbers, cross-referencing the dates printed on the court documents with my own spreadsheet. A sickening pattern began to emerge immediately. The exact days I had wired emergency funds to cover my mother's fabricated crises aligned perfectly with massive outgoing transfers from Caleb's primary care account into my parents' joint checking. They had not just taken my money. They had double-dipped, using my transfers as a smokescreen while they quietly drained his legal settlement. My eyes caught a specific line item on page 4 of the second report. It claimed an expenditure of $14,000 for a home accessibility modification. A vivid memory surfaced, sharp and undeniable. I had visited their Chesapeake house a month after that specific document was filed. The front steps were still crumbling, uneven concrete. The hallway bathroom still possessed the narrow, original doorframe that caused Caleb to bruise his knuckles against the wood every single morning. No modifications existed anywhere on the property. The money had simply vanished into their pockets. I flipped to the signature page. I wanted to believe Thomas Mercer was just a passive participant in this theft. For decades, my father cultivated the image of a quiet, exhausted man who simply let his wife handle the complicated details of our family. I wanted to believe Gloria simply slid paperwork in front of him and ordered him to sign without reading the fine print. That illusion shattered the moment I looked at the bottom of the page. Avery pointed her pen at a supplemental authorization form attached to the back of the latest filing. It approved a massive transfer from the Disability Trust to a private merchant account. On the line designated for the transfer purpose, someone had handwritten the justification. The text read, "Caregiver Housing Stability." The letters were slanted, written in thick black ink. It was not my mother's looping cursive. It was my father's precise architectural print. He had used those exact words to me on the phone 18 months ago when he claimed they were dipping into the mortgage fund to save Caleb. Thomas was not blindly signing papers to keep the peace. He was actively crafting the vocabulary for the lies. The quiet, passive father routine was just a strategy to avoid accountability. He understood exactly what they were doing, and he executed the fraud with total, calculated awareness. The retaliation for our secret meetings started 2 days later. My mobile phone vibrated continuously against the kitchen counter. Relatives who had not spoken to me in years suddenly felt compelled to leave lengthy voicemails. An aunt from Georgia left a message accusing Evan of turning me against my own flesh and blood. A cousin suggested I was trying to steal my brother's trust fund to finance a lavish military lifestyle. The voices sounded identical, echoing the exact same phrasing. My mother had clearly distributed a script. Evan poured 2 cups of black coffee and set one near my hand. The bitter aroma filled the kitchen, grounding me in the present moment. He opened his laptop, navigated to a social media platform, and turned the screen toward me. Gloria had posted a massive status update. The text did not mention my name, but the target was unmistakable. She lamented the endless heartbreak of raising children who abandon their disabled siblings. The final paragraph contained a vague, venomous accusation about daughters who prioritize purchasing luxury cars over basic family loyalty. My mother was planting seeds. She was preparing the social ground for a public execution, ensuring that when the conflict finally erupted, our entire extended family would view me as the greedy villain. My fingers hovered over my laptop keyboard. A dozen angry rebuttals formed in my mind. I wanted to upload the fake invoices for everyone to see. I wanted to post the confirmation email from the clinic. I wanted to scream the truth until the walls of my house shook. Evan placed his hand softly over mine. His palm felt warm against my cold skin. He did not tell me to calm down, and he did not offer useless platitudes about taking the high road. My husband just looked at the glowing screen and waited for me to process the moment. I pulled my hand back. I took a digital screenshot of her post, saved the image file into my encrypted folder, and closed the browser. I navigated to my own privacy settings, locked every account to maximum security, and set my phone to silent mode. Engaging in a public shouting match would only give Gloria the chaotic attention she desperately craved. Silence was a weapon she did not expect me to use. It drove her absolutely crazy when she could not force a reaction out of me, and right now, protecting the legal strategy was far more important than winning an argument on the internet. By the end of the week, the suffocating tension in the air finally snapped. Caleb did not show up for his scheduled session at the Vocational Rehabilitation Center on Thursday morning. Mara Ellis called me from a blocked number just after lunch. She kept her voice strictly professional, speaking quickly and quietly to avoid being overheard in the administrative office. The specialist stated only that Gloria had formally withdrawn Caleb from the entire program. The official reason listed on the facility paperwork was mandatory medical rest. Panic spiked sharp and hot behind my ribs. Withdrawing him meant completely isolating him from the outside world. It meant cutting off his access to the prepaid phone we had hidden in his locker. He was trapped inside that house with two people who knew the walls were slowly closing in around them. The sun went down, casting long, distorted shadows across my living room floor. I paced the length of the hardwood, the rhythmic squeak of my shoes, the only sound in the quiet house. Evan sat on the sofa, tracking my movements, keeping his phone resting on his knee. We waited for any update from the legal team. Avery had filed an emergency petition the moment Mara confirmed the withdrawal, but the judicial system moved at its own agonizing pace. Every passing hour felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it difficult to pull a full breath into my lungs. At 1:45, my phone illuminated the dark room. The caller ID displayed Avery Sloan. I snatched the device from the table and answered before the second ring. The plastic casing felt slick against my sweating palm. The attorney skipped the standard greeting entirely. Her voice sounded breathless, completely lacking its usual measured calm. The background noise on her end consisted of shuffling papers and the rapid clicking of a computer mouse. "They know Caleb spoke to us," Avery said, the words rushing out in a single urgent breath. "Your father just submitted a priority request to the bank. They are trying to move the rest of the money before morning." Avery's midnight warning about the massive bank transfer echoed in my mind for days. The financial institution flagged the sudden movement of funds, placing a temporary administrative hold on the account, which bought our legal team a fragile window of time. That narrow window covered the first week of June. It covered my wedding day. The afternoon reception took place under a large white tent facing the bay. The string quartet played softly in the corner, and the sharp scent of roasted garlic and salt water drifted through the humid Virginia air. Evan and I stood before the tiered cake, holding a silver knife together. Just beyond the edge of the dance floor, 3 empty folding chairs remained perfectly aligned in the front row. My aunt approached me while the caterers poured champagne. She kept her voice pitched low, casting nervous glances at the empty seats. She suggested we ask the staff to remove the chairs so they would not ruin the professional photographs. I looked at the older woman, keeping my posture entirely relaxed. "Leave them exactly where they are," I told her. The aunt shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable, but she walked away without another word. I did not want a revised version of family history. I refused to grab a microphone and deliver a dramatic speech denouncing my parents to the guests. Instead, I focused on Evan, letting the reality of their absence speak entirely for itself. As the reception began winding down and the staff started clearing the tables, I stepped into the quiet hallway near the coat check. I held the smuggled birthday card in my hand, dialing the secure prepaid phone we had hidden in Caleb's locker weeks ago. My brother answered on the 4th ring. His voice came through the speaker in a rushed, breathless whisper. "Nat, I didn't tell them about the bank letter." The sudden clarification hit me hard. He thought I was calling to accuse him of leaking our legal strategy. "I know you did not tell them," I reassured him, keeping my volume barely above a whisper. "The bank flagged the transfer automatically. You did nothing wrong. Why did you not come today?" Caleb hesitated, the line crackling with static. "Mom said you did not want a sick person in the wedding photos. She said I would ruin the aesthetic." My fingernails dug into the leather casing of my phone. Gloria had not simply kept him home out of spite. The woman had weaponized his own disability against him, ensuring he felt like a burden to the one sibling trying to pull him out. I closed my eyes, forcing my breathing to slow down before I responded. "You were invited," I told him, making sure every syllable landed clearly. "You are still my brother, and I wanted you there. We will talk about this soon, but right now, I need you to stay safe." The lie my mother told him was incredibly cruel, but the paper trail Avery was today. The week following the ceremony involved relentless legal maneuvering. I traded my wedding dress for conservative civilian clothes, spending hours inside Avery's conference room. The attorney drafted a comprehensive emergency petition, utilizing the documented transfer attempt, the sudden withdrawal from the vocational center, and Mara's time-stamped clinical affidavits. Caleb met with Avery and an independent communication facilitator in a secure location. He did not sit back and let me take the wheel. My brother read the petition, asked questions when the legal terminology confused him, and ultimately signed the document himself. He was the primary petitioner, formally asking the circuit court to strip our parents of their authority. I simply provided a supporting affidavit detailing the historical financial transfers from my personal accounts. I was a witness, not a savior. On June 14th, exactly 1 week after the wedding, Evan drove me to a luxury dealership in downtown Norfolk. The showroom floor smelled of expensive rubber and polished tile. Resting under the bright overhead lights sat the $135,000 Porsche I had ordered months in advance. The vehicle was flawless, paid for entirely by the proceeds from my Virginia Beach townhouse sale and my personal military savings. But standing in front of the sleek metal, the ghost of my mother's endless guilt trips whispered loudly in my ear. I crossed my arms, seriously considering telling the salesman to cancel the entire transaction. Evan stepped into my line of sight, completely blocking my view of the car. He handed me the purchase agreement and a black ink pen. "Are you going to let her dictate what you are allowed to enjoy for the rest of your life?" he asked quietly. "Because if you walk away from this, she still controls your money." I took the pen, walked over to the glass desk, and signed my name on the bottom line. The dealership manager handed me the keys and asked if their social media coordinator could take a quick photograph for their corporate page. I agreed, assuming the image would just disappear into the endless void of the internet. There was no bragging caption, no arrogant display of wealth, just a simple tag confirming the delivery. I drove the car home, finally allowing myself to enjoy a quiet, hard-earned victory. But a public photograph is exactly what a predator uses to manufacture a crisis. On June 28th, exactly 3 weeks after the wedding, my mobile phone erupted with notifications. I was sitting in my kitchen when the screen lit up with dozens of incoming text messages. I unlocked the device and opened the extended family group chat. Gloria had taken a screenshot of the dealership's Instagram post, circling the price of the car in bright red digital ink. Her accompanying message contained a single, venomous sentence. "Now we know where Caleb's money went." The barrage of calls from aunts, uncles, and distant cousins started almost immediately. They demanded explanations, accusing me of abandoning my disabled brother and stealing his settlement to fund a lavish lifestyle. I ignored every single call. I sat at the kitchen island, watching the screen light up repeatedly, completely refusing to engage with the manufactured outrage. 10 minutes later, a direct message arrived from Thomas. The text was brief and commanding, lacking any punctuation. "Family meeting, tomorrow. Bring the car papers." They believed they had finally cornered me. They thought the social pressure of the extended family would force me to crawl back to Chesapeake, begging for forgiveness and ready to sign whatever confession they put in front of me. They had no idea the legal machinery was already moving. The morning of June 29th arrived with thick, suffocating humidity. I had a formal change of command ceremony at the naval base early that morning, which required me to wear my service dress blues. The heavy, dark fabric and gold striping felt like armor as I stood at attention on the parade deck. Just before 9 o'clock, my phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. I stepped away from the crowd and answered. Avery was on the line, her voice tight with adrenaline. "The judge just signed the temporary emergency order," the attorney confirmed. "Your father's conservator authority is officially suspended as of this exact minute. The accounts are completely frozen. Denise Park has been appointed as the emergency fiduciary, and a specialized transport team is currently moving Caleb to a temporary safe apartment." He went voluntarily. I let out a long, shaky breath. The trap was finally set. I drove back to my house, grabbed my leather briefcase, and carefully packed 2 thick manila folders. One contained the closing statements, the wire receipts, and the purchase agreement for the Porsche. The other contained the freshly signed court documents. I navigated the familiar route toward Chesapeake, pulling into my parents' driveway just before noon. I parked the sleek vehicle directly behind my father's old sedan, cut the engine, and stepped out into the midday heat. Through the front living room window, I could clearly see the interior of the house. Thomas stood near the heavy oak dining table, deliberately placing a thick stack of documents near the center. Gloria stood beside him, grabbing the wooden back of Caleb's usual chair and dragging it aggressively into the hallway, physically erasing my brother's presence from the room. I adjusted the cuffs of my uniform, gripped the handle of my briefcase, and walked up the front steps to ring the doorbell. I was no longer the obedient daughter showing up to take her punishment. I was a naval officer carrying a state circuit court order, and I was about to end their reign entirely. I rang the doorbell, and the sound echoed through the hallway with a sharp, insistent ring. My mother opened the door before the chime had even finished. She wore her usual house dress, her hair pinned back with practiced indifference, but her eyes glittered with a frantic, predatory energy. "You are late," she snapped, stepping aside to let me pass. I did not offer an apology. I walked into the dining room, my heels clicking firmly against the hardwood. The familiar scent of wood polish and stale air filled my lungs, a scent that once signified home but now felt like the interior of a trap. My father stood at the far end of the dining table, his frame looking smaller than I remembered. He adjusted his glasses, his gaze darting toward my briefcase before he looked back to my face. Gloria followed close behind, her presence a heavy, invisible weight. She did not bother with pleasantries. She pointed to the empty space where Caleb usually sat. "Tell your brother what you bought with his money," my mother ordered. Thomas nudged the thick stack of papers across the table. "Bring the car papers, Natalie. We know you took funds from the trust to purchase that vehicle. Sign this document so we can settle the matter before it leaves this house." I looked down at the paperwork he had pushed toward me. It was a formal acknowledgement of debt. The language was suffocating, forcing me to admit I had misappropriated money from Caleb's account to fund my luxury lifestyle. One specific clause required me to formally waive any legal right to ever request a forensic audit of their management. "Who drafted this?" I asked, looking up at my father. Thomas cleared his throat, avoiding my direct gaze. "A lawyer friend of mine. It is standard for family mediation." "He is not a lawyer," I said quietly, hearing the tremor of desperation in his voice. "He is someone who knows you are in trouble." My mother moved to stand behind my father, resting her hands on his shoulders, her grip tight enough to dig into his fabric. "If you sign it, we will tell the rest of the family it was just a misunderstanding. We will tell them you made a mistake, and we will protect your reputation." I listened to her weave the narrative, keeping my expression perfectly still. I waited for them to exhaust their script. I needed them to put every single threat and every false claim into the air before I introduced the reality of their situation. I needed them to confirm they were acting with total awareness. "Why does this document mention an audit if this is just a private family matter regarding a car?" I asked, turning the question back to my father. Thomas shifted, looking at his wife for direction. The accountant misunderstood some of the transfers in the annual report. "This waiver clears up the confusion." "The money is yours to explain," I said, finally reaching into my bag. I opened the first folder, I pulled out the closing statement for the Virginia Beach townhouse, the original wire receipt from the sale, and the purchase agreement for the Porsche. I laid them out in a neat, sequential row on the table. Each document held a clear timestamp and a verified bank account number. The Porsche had been bought with my own labor, my own mortgage payments, and my own bank account. "The car is mine," I told them, my voice cutting through the humid room. "The money missing from Caleb's account, however, is yours to explain." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. My father blinked, staring at the bank details in front of him. My mother's hands went still on his shoulders. I reached into the second folder. I pulled out the emergency court order, keeping it face down until the very last second. I flipped the document over, pushing the heavy, embossed seal across the wood so they could read the header. Thomas leaned over, his spectacles sliding down his nose as he read the words out loud. "Emergency order suspending conservator authority." He staggered back, his face draining of color, and let out a soft, ragged whisper. "You cannot do this to us." "I did not," I replied, standing my ground. "Caleb asked the court to stop you." The front door opened a moment later. A process server, a man I had hired to ensure every legal requirement was met, stepped into the hallway. He did not say a word. He simply approached the table and served the official papers, explaining the legal implications of the court's decision to freeze the assets. My mother's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She grabbed the edge of the dining table, her knuckles white. "Caleb does not have the capacity to understand what he is doing. You manipulated him. You poisoned his mind because you are jealous of the sacrifices we made for him." I did not raise my voice, and I did not let her draw me into a debate about my brother's mental status. The court had already spoken. "The judge will hear from him directly," I said, turning to walk toward the door. As I reached the threshold, I noticed the open closet in the hallway. A suitcase sat there, stuffed haphazardly with Caleb's clothing. Most of it was the wrong size, and the essential medication he required daily was noticeably absent from the interior. They had been planning to drag him across state lines before the order arrived. The bank envelope I had seen earlier in the hallway was a transfer notice, a final attempt to liquidate the account before the freeze took effect. I walked out to the Porsche, the silence of the driveway feeling like a physical relief. I had survived the family meeting, but as I started the engine, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. A message from the prepaid burner phone Caleb kept hidden in his locker. Gloria had clearly intercepted my departure because the message arrived from her account, not his. "Caleb called me," the text read. "He says he wants to come home." I felt a cold shiver pass through me. I knew my brother had not sent those words. He did not know how to bypass the security on his own device, and he certainly did not have the vocabulary to write such a clean, manipulative lie. I typed a single response before putting the car in gear. That was not me. My hand moved to the gear shift. I had done my part. The legal fire was burning, and no amount of text messages from my mother would be able to extinguish it now. The time for arguing was over. The time for consequences had begun. Gloria did not stop after the court order arrived. She merely shifted the theater of the war, weaponizing the family name to insulate herself from the consequences of her financial crimes. My mobile phone became a constant source of disruption, with aunts and distant cousins calling to deliver pre-scripted lines about my cold heart and my supposed desire to drag Caleb into an institution. Avery Sloan instructed me to provide no public response, so I remained silent. I kept my social media accounts locked, directing every inquiry toward our legal counsel. The attorney sent formal notifications to every relative who reached out, clarifying that Caleb was currently situated in a secure, self-determined living environment and had legal counsel protecting his interests. Inside the temporary apartment, Caleb began the process of reclaiming his autonomy. Avery held sessions where my brother could speak freely without someone hovering over his shoulder. During those meetings, Caleb insisted he wanted to attend the formal court hearing. He did not want to remain a ghost in his own life, hidden away until the legal proceedings concluded. We arranged for a communication facilitator to assist him during the testimony, ensuring he had the time he needed to articulate his thoughts without being interrupted or spoken over. Denise Park, the forensic accountant appointed by the court, spent her days buried in the boxes of bank statements and falsified accounting records we had provided. She arrived at my office one afternoon, her expression unreadable as she placed a thick folder on my desk. The woman had been tracing the money trails for weeks, following the flow of the disability funds that had allegedly gone toward physical therapy. Denise opened the folder, her finger tracing a line item marked as a therapeutic service provider payment. She explained that while the documentation looked professional, the merchant account linked to the payment processor was not a medical facility at all. It was a dormant business entity registered in my mother's name, one that had not conducted legitimate operations in over a decade. My stomach turned. It was not just a case of my mother overstating costs or mismanaging a few $100s. She had systematically fabricated a medical expense to channel disability money into a private account she controlled. The total amount used for her personal expenses, covering everything from mortgage payments on their house to payments on their luxury SUV, surpassed $220,000. The day of the temporary hearing finally arrived. The courtroom felt sterile and imposing, the air conditioned to a shivering temperature. Gloria walked in wearing a soft beige sweater, her head bowed in a show of performative exhaustion. Thomas trailed behind her, looking like a man who had suddenly realized he was standing on the edge of a very steep cliff. Gloria spoke with practiced ease, her tone steady as she described the endless, exhausting labor of caring for a son with complex medical needs. She claimed Caleb lacked the capacity to make even basic decisions about his daily routine. Thomas joined the narrative, insisting they had no knowledge of the suspicious financial movements, claiming they simply deferred to the experts. Avery stood up, her presence commanding and precise. She did not raise her voice, yet her words sliced through the courtroom's heavy atmosphere. The attorney presented the transfer requests, the evidence of the planned travel meant to isolate Caleb from the legal system, and the handwritten acknowledgement of debt my parents had tried to force me to sign. She invited Mara to the stand, where the specialist testified about how Gloria consistently silenced Caleb during every single evaluation. Then came the moment my brother had prepared for. The facilitator stepped forward, and Caleb was sworn in. The judge looked down from the bench, his expression neutral. He asked Caleb if he understood why he was present. My brother paused, his hands clenching slightly in his lap as he gathered his thoughts. The silence in the room was absolute, every eye fixed on him. "I need help with some things," Caleb said, his voice slow but clear. "I cannot manage the bank paperwork or the house maintenance by myself, but that does not mean everything I own belongs to them. I did not ask Natalie to become my guardian. I asked her to believe me." Gloria attempted to stand up and interrupt, but the judge raised a hand, ordering her to remain seated. My brother looked directly at her, his posture straightening for the first time in my memory. He did not look like the victim they had spent years describing to anyone who would listen. He looked like an adult who had finally found the strength to say no. The court issued a ruling that afternoon. Denise Park would remain the emergency conservator until a comprehensive audit concluded, and the judge restricted Gloria from having any unsupervised contact with Caleb during the ongoing investigation. The order to surrender his personal documents, including his passport and bank access, became mandatory effective immediately. As we walked out of the courthouse, the humidity hit us like a physical wall. The stress of the past month had clearly fractured my parents' alliance. Thomas looked as though he was on the verge of a complete collapse, his skin gray and translucent under the harsh midday sun. Denise followed me toward the parking garage, carrying a final report that had just been generated by the bank. She seemed hesitant, her professional mask slipping for a brief second. "I have one more piece of the puzzle," Denise said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "This is the accounting record your father personally submitted to the court during the previous cycle. Look at the certification at the bottom of the last page." I took the paper, my pulse thudding in my ears. The page was stamped with a date from early the previous year. My father had signed his name with the same precise architectural print I had seen on the merchant authorization form. "Your father did not just approve the transfers," Denise explained, watching my face. "He certified under oath that none of the transfers to that personal merchant account existed at all. He had not just stolen the money, he had committed perjury to keep the theft hidden from the court." The realization felt less like an emotional blow and more like a final cold piece of logic clicking into place. There was no room left for mercy, and there was certainly no room left for the man I had once called a passive, well-meaning father. He was a co-conspirator, a man who had gambled his own integrity to protect a lifestyle built on his son's stolen life. I walked to my car, the weight of the paper in my hands feeling heavier than any suitcase I had ever carried. The criminal investigation was now inevitable. Every invoice, every email, every signature was about to be turned over to the prosecutor. The quiet life they had carefully built around their lives was about to be dismantled, one piece of evidence at a time. I was not the one ending their life as they knew it. They had been orchestrating their own destruction for the last decade, and I was simply the one who had finally stopped looking away. The full guardianship hearing took place 3 months after the emergency petition, a period that felt like it lasted a lifetime. During those 90 days, Caleb underwent a series of independent evaluations requested by the court. The medical professionals found that, while my brother required ongoing assistance with high-level financial transactions and complex contractual obligations, he demonstrated a consistent ability to express his own preferences and understand the fundamental consequences of his decisions. He began practicing the management of a small personal budget with a neutral support coordinator. I purposefully stepped back from the process, attending only as an observer when invited, ensuring every choice remained entirely his. The courtroom on the day of the hearing felt more like a cage than a place of justice. My parents' legal counsel attempted a final desperate play, dragging in medical reports from 16 years earlier, dating back to the immediate aftermath of Caleb's accident. They painted a picture of a man frozen in time, insisting that his cognitive capacity could not possibly have evolved. They argued that any signs of independence I had witnessed were merely sophisticated illusions I had planted in his mind. Avery Sloane waited for them to finish, her face entirely composed. When she rose, the attorney introduced the new, court-ordered evaluations, side by side with the records showing my parents had actively blocked any attempt at a re-evaluation for over a decade. The contrast between their outdated, weaponized diagnosis and the reality of the man sitting next to me was stark. Then came the moment of truth. My father, realizing the ship was rapidly taking on water, decided to abandon his partner. Thomas testified that he had only signed the financial filings because Gloria handled the intricate details of the household, claiming he trusted her implicitly. It was a pathetic, cowardly performance. Denise Park, the court-appointed fiduciary, stood up and introduced the electronic bank records. She presented the transfer authorizations bearing my father's handwriting, demonstrating that he had not just been a passive observer, he had been the primary enforcer. Denise displayed emails between the two of them, where my father specifically asked Gloria which category he should use to disguise the embezzlement in the annual reports, settling on the misleading term of housing stability. The look of utter betrayal on my mother's face was almost worth the trauma of the last year. Their fragile, complicit alliance crumbled under the weight of their own documented greed. The fake therapy invoices finally collapsed under professional scrutiny. The representative from the medical center testified that not a single one of the bills Gloria had sent to me had originated from their system. Further investigation into the merchant account numbers Gloria had used revealed a direct link to a private business entity she had maintained in total secrecy. The invoices were not just errors in bookkeeping. They were a deliberate mechanism of extortion, a way to use my own love for my brother as a continuous source of tax-free income. Caleb eventually took the stand. He did not deliver a perfect, polished monologue. He spoke slowly, pausing to find the right words, often asking the attorneys to repeat a question to ensure he understood the context. He spoke about his need for support, but he also spoke about his right to be heard. "I need help with some things," Caleb said, his voice quiet but steady. "That does not mean everything I own belongs to them. I did not ask Natalie to become my guardian. I asked her to believe me." The courtroom fell into a profound, suffocating silence. Even the court reporter seemed to slow down, capturing the weight of his simple, devastating truth. My mother tried to interrupt, let out a sharp, hysterical sob, but the judge motioned for the bailiff to keep order. The final verdict arrived just before the afternoon adjournment. The judge terminated my father's role as conservator permanently. My mother's guardianship over Caleb's personal life was similarly stripped away, reduced to a limited oversight role that would sunset completely within months, effectively ending her power over his daily existence. The court appointed a neutral fiduciary to manage the complex assets and ordered both parents to pay full restitution for the funds they had drained. As the judge finished his closing remarks, he looked directly at my parents. "Guardianship is not ownership," the judge stated, his voice ringing against the wood paneling. "You were appointed to protect him. You made his dependence profitable." Gloria turned to Caleb, tears streaming down her face, insisting she had dedicated her entire life to his care. My brother looked at her, his expression devoid of the fear he had carried for 16 years. "You spent my life for me," Caleb replied. We walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding July heat. The legal battle had concluded, but the shadow of the fallout still loomed. Avery caught up with us by the parking lot, her briefcase tucked tightly under her arm. The attorney explained that the civil restitution was only the beginning. The evidence we had presented was already in the hands of the prosecutor, and a grand jury was currently reviewing the records regarding the perjury and the extensive financial fraud. Gloria saw us standing there and lunged forward, her composure finally shattering into pure, spiteful venom. She gripped the railing, her eyes locking onto mine, the mask of the mourning mother finally falling away to reveal the predator beneath. "You think this is over? Because a judge gave him a choice?" she shrieked. I looked at the woman who had spent years manipulating my brother, feeling no desire to scream back. "No," I replied, my voice calm and final. "I think it is beginning because you no longer have one." I left them standing on the courthouse steps, two people who had gambled their family's integrity for cash, realizing they had lost everything. I did not watch them leave. I walked to my car, breathed in the hot, clean air, and opened the door for Caleb. We drove away from the building, not toward a destination chosen by a judge or a legal team, but simply away from the people who had tried to define us for their own benefit. The road ahead felt clear, wide, and entirely our own to navigate. The resolution of our lives did not arrive with a singular, dramatic explosion, but rather through a series of quiet, final echoes. By July of 2026, the legal firestorm had finally burned down to embers. The forensic audit, a process that felt like it spanned an eternity, had meticulously traced every cent of the misappropriated funds, forcing a reckoning that even my parents could not negotiate away. I sat at my kitchen table, the early morning sunlight warming the wood, and looked at the final settlement paperwork. The process of holding them accountable had been grueling. There were no easy wins in criminal proceedings, only the slow, grinding machinery of justice. Gloria and Thomas had eventually entered separate pleas, their attempts to shift blame onto each other collapsing when confronted with the mountain of evidence Denise Park had compiled. My mother received a sentence of 2 years and 6 months of incarceration, followed by a long period of supervised probation. The court had stripped her of every credential she had used to control Caleb. She would never again be permitted to act as a guardian, a fiduciary, or a representative payee for any person. The public image she had curated for decades, that of the saintly, suffering mother, disintegrated once the merchant account links to her personal business came to light. The loss of her reputation seemed to hit her even harder than the loss of her freedom. When she had tried to argue during the sentencing phase that she gave her life to care for him, Caleb simply looked at her, his expression entirely devoid of the fear that once ruled his existence. My father received 18 months of custodial time, followed by probation. The man who had once tried to manipulate me into paying his legal fees with his family-first rhetoric eventually called me from the holding facility. He spoke in the same low, gravelly rumble, asking for assistance with his defense costs, claiming that a family should not abandon each other during a crisis. I listened to his voice, remembering the years I had sacrificed my own financial security to keep his house afloat. I did not raise my voice, and I did not let his familiar tone of wounded authority pull me back into the old dynamic. I told him no, my voice remaining perfectly steady. "You taught me actions have consequences," I replied. "I finally believed you." The court imposed a series of liens and surcharges on the assets they had clung to so desperately. The house in Chesapeake and the luxury vehicle they had flaunted were liquidated to pay back the stolen settlement. Every cent collected was placed into a protected trust, managed by a professional firm, ensuring that Caleb's future was finally insulated from those who had once viewed his disability as a reliable source of income. I did not take a single penny of the restitution. I refused the money they offered, and I certainly refused to contribute to their defense. The only objects I kept from that house were a small cardboard box filled with old family photographs and the original birthday card Caleb had smuggled to me. I did not feel a desire to buy back the house or the furniture. They were symbols of a distorted past, and I was far more interested in the future we were currently building. Some of our extended relatives eventually reached out to offer weak, self-serving apologies. They claimed they had no idea the financial exploitation was occurring, painting themselves as victims of my mother's masterful deception. I kept those interactions brief and controlled. I told them that one did not need bank statements to know something was wrong. They only needed to listen to the person standing right in front of them, but they had chosen to ignore Caleb for 16 years because it was easier to believe the lie. I did not cut off everyone, but I maintained a strict boundary, keeping the people who had actively ignored my brother's pain at a distance. Caleb moved into a modern, supportive apartment complex located in a neighborhood with plenty of green space and walkable streets. He curated his own environment, selecting furniture that matched his personality and finding a part-time role at a community garden that did not treat him like a patient. I watched him settle into his new life, seeing the small, specific ways he was learning to exist without the weight of expectations pressing down on him. He still struggled with complex financial math, and he still occasionally bought items he could not truly afford. One afternoon, I stood in his living room, watching him hold a high-end electronic device he clearly did not need. My instinct, the old, desperate need to protect him from any possible failure, surged, urging me to step in, to lecture him, and to take the item back to the store. I stopped myself. I forced my hands into my pockets and took a deep, steadying breath. Caleb caught me watching, realized the item was a poor choice, and sheepishly put it back in the bag. He called his support coordinator, admitted he had made a mistake, and started the process of returning the device. He did not need me to be his judge. He needed me to be his sister. That moment, witnessing him identify his own mistake and correct it without my intervention, was the most significant victory of the entire experience. My own life felt lighter, though the scars remained as quiet reminders of what we had survived. I no longer felt the need to apologize for my existence or justify the joy I found in my own successes. Evan and I had moved into a rhythm that felt grounded and honest. On a bright Saturday morning in July, I pulled the Porsche into the visitor parking space in front of Caleb's apartment building. I did not open the door and tell him where we were going. I simply waited as he walked out, his stride confident, his shoulders loose. I asked him the only question that mattered now. Where do you want to go? Caleb thought for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon, before he chose the coast. He picked the route and even insisted on selecting the music for the drive. He walked to the passenger side, sat down, and clicked his seatbelt into place with a definitive, satisfying snap. As we pulled out of the parking lot, the sunlight glinting off the hood of the car, my brother looked at his apartment building and whispered the word home. I did not ask if he meant the apartment, the car, or simply the feeling of belonging to himself again. I did not have to. I had spent years believing that love meant carrying everyone on my back, exhausting my own resources until there was nothing left. My brother had taught me that real love could also mean waiting beside someone, steady and silent, while they finally discovered the courage to choose their own road. I put the car in gear and turned toward the sea. For the first time in our family, no one answered for Caleb. I waited. He chose the road. Then I drove. The engine hummed with a quiet, powerful energy beneath us, and for the first time in 16 years, the path forward belonged entirely to us. The past was a closed chapter, a long, difficult lesson in the necessity of boundaries, but the future was a wide, open horizon that Caleb would define on his own terms, and I would be there not as his protector, but as his sister, watching him walk into a life he had earned, one step at a time. The air in the car smelled of summer, of freedom, and of the quiet, steady promise of a brand new day. I turned up the music, allowed myself to smile, and kept my eyes fixed on the path ahead, finally free of the weight that had once threatened to pull us both under. If you are currently trapped in the exhausting cycle of being the family savior, you need to understand that your capacity to help others is not an infinite resource, and it is certainly not a measurement of your worth. For years, I believed that love was synonymous with sacrifice, and that by carrying the weight of everyone else's failures, I was fulfilling a duty that validated my existence. I was wrong, and if you are listening to this right now, feeling the same suffocating pressure to be the constant provider for family members who refuse to help themselves, you are likely wrong too. The most dangerous lesson my family taught me was that my value depended on my ability to solve problems that were never mine to solve in the first place. You have to recognize that when you consistently step in to fix the messes created by manipulative family members, you are not acting out of love. You are inadvertently participating in their dysfunction by removing the consequences that might otherwise force them to change. The realization that you must set boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary act of survival. You might feel that if you stop paying the bills, stop answering the frantic middle-of-the-night calls, or stop volunteering for every emotional crisis, you are failing your family. But consider what you are actually doing. You are keeping them in a state of arrested development. You are allowing them to remain stagnant because you have become the safety net that prevents them from ever having to face the reality of their own poor choices. Real support is not about providing a cushion for a bottomless pit. Real support is about empowering individuals to build their own foundations. If someone in your life refuses to take responsibility for their finances, their health, or their decisions, no amount of money or emotional labor on your part will ever be enough. You are chasing a goalpost that they will move every time you get close, because as long as they can rely on you, they will never have to rely on themselves. Look at the patterns in your own life. With the same clinical, detached honesty that I had to apply to my parents' bank statements. Are you always the one expected to give, while others take without hesitation? Does your family treat your boundaries as suggestions or as personal insults? If your family reacts with rage, shame, or guilt the moment you stop providing, they are not grieving the loss of your support, they are grieving the loss of your obedience. They want the role you have been playing, the invisible, inexhaustible engine of their convenience, not the actual person you are. When you start saying no, the noise will get louder before it gets quieter. They will use every weapon in their arsenal: family reputation, the history of what they have sacrificed, the accusation that you have changed, to pull you back into your box. You must hold firm, because that rage is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that your boundaries are finally, effectively working. You must accept that you cannot save anyone who is not willing to save themselves, and you certainly cannot save them by destroying your own future in the process. My brother needed support, not a proxy parent, and once I understood that, I had to be brave enough to step aside so he could find his own voice. Ask yourself, if you were to walk away tomorrow and stop providing the support that is currently draining your sanity and your savings, what would actually happen? Would they find a way to manage, or would they collapse? If you are terrified that they would collapse, you are not a partner in their life, you are a captive in their delusion. You are holding up a ceiling that is already falling, and all you are succeeding in doing is getting crushed underneath it while they stand safely on the other side of your sacrifice. You are deserving of a life that is not defined by the crises of other people. Your money, your time, and your emotional energy belong to you, and you have every right to invest them in your own growth rather than subsidizing someone else's refusal to mature. It is a terrifying realization, admitting that the people you were taught to serve above all else are the very ones who have been holding you back, but that fear is the exact price of your eventual freedom. Once you stop being the safety net, you will finally have the freedom to see who they actually are, and more importantly, you will finally have the space to figure out who you were meant to be without them dictating your limits. I want you to think about the people in your life who constantly demand your sacrifice and ask yourself this: does your presence in their life actually improve their ability to function as an adult? Or does it simply keep them in a cycle of helplessness that serves them while draining you? Are you truly helping them? Or are you just paying for the right to avoid the conflict that would happen if you were to finally stand up for yourself? Take a moment to consider that, and then tell me, how much of your own life have you already signed away to people who would never dream of making the same sacrifice for you?